The single biggest change in the city of Santa Cruz that has affected housing was the decision of the regents of the University of California in the late 1950s, early 1960s to locate a campus of the university here in Santa Cruz. And let me say why, because this is not blaming them. This is understanding what happened at that moment. In that moment that the regents made that decision, think about what Santa Cruz was in that moment. It was a relatively lightly populated city that was, many folks in the community were retired folks. The city was represented vertically integrated by Republicans at the Assembly, State Senate, and Congressional level, and had been for a long time. And the University of California comes to town with a new campus. The fathers and mothers who had begged the university to come to town in the 50s and very early 60s had an image of what was going to arrive. They knew the University of California and public universities throughout the country as being higher education institutions, very serious about their work. With the Master Plan on Higher Education in 1959, the Donahue Act created the University of California to be the basic research institution, California State University to be the teaching institution, and community colleges to be the true up. The community thought it had a pretty good idea of what was coming their way. Between the time the university regents decided to come to Santa Cruz and the campus opened, virtually every public university in the United States became a hotbed of largely liberal activities, anti-war, environment, feminism, many political movements in the United States that emerged and grew had their start in the early to mid 1960s. So by the time the university arrives, the folks who asked for it to come, thinking it was coming in one form, it arrived in another. Simultaneous with that, in those years in the 1960s following the Second World War, as the defense industry is transitioning to become the high technology industry and specifically moving out of the space of being largely defense oriented to being personally oriented, such as the Lisa computer followed by other personal computers. What we saw was that the Silicon Valley was emerging as the most powerful economic engine in the world and showing no signs of slowing down, which brought people from all over the world into the Silicon Valley, many of whom got a look at Santa Cruz and said, I want to be in Santa Cruz. And so the combination of the arrival of the university as a changed entity from what the community thought they were getting, and the arrival of the Silicon Valley's economic explosion, Santa Cruz found itself in a place where the question became, are we any longer in charge of our own destiny? And so what we saw in the 1970s was a community agitating, both at the county level and the city level, to simply not be overrun by, at that point, largely the Silicon Valley, and have it become something somebody else thought it should be rather than what Santa Cruz thought it should be. That then gave rise in the county to the adoption of Measure J, the county's growth management ordinance, and the Greenbelt Initiative inside the city, which was the city's growth management concept. At that time, in the 70s and 80s, and even into the early 90s, politically, what trumped everything was managing our growth and protecting our environment. Those were the same years when administration after administration at the national level was offering offshore oil leases that we could have seen offshore oil drilling in the Monterey Bay area. Fights against that. Seeing that the city had plans in the 1950s and 60s to annex the property from the western edge of the city to Davenport and build a community of 30,000 new homes with a nuclear power plant at Davenport, an application for which had been submitted by Pacific Gas and Electric Company to the California Public Utilities Commission for approval. So you think of the 1970s and 1980s as a period where the political value was manage our growth, prevent offshore oil drilling, prevent this massive new development up to Davenport, prevent nuclear power plant from being built, and on and on. So what trumped every other political value was managing our growth. That's not without consequences. And the single largest consequence was that by limiting our growth and limiting our supply of housing, then of course, you don't have to be the chair of the Federal Reserve Board to figure out what's going to happen. Limit the supply, the demand is unyielding, you are going to become one of the least affordable places to live in the United States. That should not be a surprise. So now we get into the late 90s and especially into the 2000s. And for people like myself, who we were in our 30s, 40s, and 50s in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and our value was growth management, the new value is, well, I want to live here. Thank you for protecting against offshore oil drilling and a nuclear power plant and a new city basically of 30,000. Thank you very much for all. That's all baked in. I love my community. I want to live here when I graduate or when I become an adult or whatever it may be. I want to stay here. Where's the housing I can afford to do that? And so now folks who are in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, their highest political value is, highest priority and political value is housing. Because they've already baked it in that we're not going to have offshore oil drilling. We're not going to have this community between our western edge and Davenport. We're not going to have nuclear power plants. That's what they like. They like this. And they'd want to live here. So the challenge becomes, how do you do that? The state of California has looked, through the eyes of the legislature, has looked at every community in California and believes that for different reasons, maybe than Santa Cruz has, but for reasons of their own, many communities have severely limited the number of housing units that they approve, and especially in the very low and low income category. Such that the state has said, we are going to take away from you the power to say no, in many instances, to proposed development. That is something which sounds good to people who want to live here, who either move here, want to move here, they're growing up here and want to stay. That looks good to them. They think that's a good idea because they've already believed that these other issues which they care deeply about, environmental protection and so on, they're very happy that we have strong policies on that. Here comes the challenge. It is not possible, it should be purged from everybody's mind, that somehow in Santa Cruz we can adjust the supply and demand balance such that the price of housing, of market rate housing, is bent downward. That isn't going to happen. You would have to be talking about taking a city of 66,000 and making it 266 or 366,000 before the marketplace will bend the price curve. That's unacceptable to people. We're not going to do that. So the question then becomes, how do you do something on this issue? Since simply releasing market forces to deal with it is unacceptable politically because of the level of growth that would have to happen before the price curve is met. What do? I think what you do is say, we acknowledge that. Don't let anybody believe that we can, in effect, grow our way out of this problem of affordability. What can we do on affordability? Seems to me what we can do is comply with the state in terms of the number that they have given us, 4,000 new units in the city of Santa Cruz over the next 8 years. That's their idea of how to solve the problem. As a mayor, I'm an order taker on that because they've taken away my ability to say no to that. I have to say yes as a matter of law. So to say yes, where will we do that? And this gets into the politics of the city of Santa Cruz. I don't think there's an appetite in the city for saying, you know what, we've got 6 new council districts. We're just going from at-large to council districts. I don't think there's an appetite to simply say, take 4,000 housing units, divide it by 6 districts, and every district build 1/6 of 4,000 units. That's not, people aren't going to get elected to the city council who say they like that. They won't. What there is an appetite for is saying, you know what, why don't we take 40 or 45% of that number and put it in one council district. The council district south of Laurel. What smart cities do to meet these numbers is that they grow up in their urban core rather than push the growth out to their residential neighborhoods. And I think that's the smart play for the city of Santa Cruz. It's also the political reality of the city of Santa Cruz. We don't get to tell the state, I'm sorry, we can't grow that much. That's no longer on the table. We have to say yes because it's the law. So that 4,000 units, if 40 to 45% of it can be built in our downtown, south of Laurel, where we're already, most of our urban activity is, then that means you can take the other 45, 55%, divide it by 5 council districts. Now you've got a small enough number that there's an apartment building here, an apartment building there, a 6-unit here, a 6-unit there, but you're not asking any neighborhood or council district to take a number so large they can't choke it down. And it starts affecting what people call the character or the integrity of their neighborhood. It's simply not politically possible to do that. So I think the solution, to the degree that it is a solution, and I will say it's very limited, is to focus most of that in one area, which is our urban core, and have a much smaller number that we spread around the rest of the city. That to me makes good political sense. We can comply with the law, we can build more housing, and we can have it done in a way that's politically acceptable to the community. Now, having said all of that, that still doesn't go to the question of how someone who wants to move immediately into home ownership, how they can do that given the pricing. And I will tell you, I don't have an answer to that, and I don't think there is a good answer to that. I think the best we can hope for is that we can build very low, low, and moderate income housing, some of which is ownership, some of which is rental, thus having the ability for some people to get their hand on the first rung of that ladder of affordable housing. That's probably the best we can do on this. So I don't think anyone should labor under the impression that there is a solution to our housing issue which is going to result in the market providing substantial relief because we've balanced out the supply and demand. I don't think that's reasonable to expect. It's not politically possible in Santa Cruz, and the best we can do is build in our downtown most of our housing so that at least on the very low and moderate income side, there's some opportunity for upward mobility. A very significant issue in our city certainly is the notion of developing south of Laurel Street called the Downtown Expansion Plan. And this is part and parcel with the notion of where is it we build the 4,000 units over 8 years that the state of California is requiring the city to build. And I want to add something right here. Some people may say, gee, hasn't the state been giving every city and every county a housing number for years and years and years? And the answer is yes, absolutely correct. The question becomes, what is the penalty, if any, for not hitting that number? It used to be that the penalty was almost nothing. It was very light. Now the penalty is the state will be glad to take over the planning and simply say yes to everything that comes through the pipeline. So if Santa Cruz does not want the city, doesn't want the state of California to be its planning department and saying yes to every development proposal that comes along, then the city has to have a plan for how it's going to accommodate those 4,000 housing units over 8 years. The city's best chance of retaining what's left of its land use authorities, in my opinion, is to develop south of Laurel and take about 45% of that 4,000 unit number and build it in the downtown. The role of the city in that regard is to amend the general plan so that that could happen, to rezone the underlying properties consistent with the general plan designation for higher density in our downtown, and third, to process an amendment to our city's local coastal plan and submit that to the California Coastal Commission to show how on that side of things we are consistent with the Coastal Act, show the State of California Department of Housing and Community Development how we will hit the number of 4,000 housing units, and to do that in a way that will offer a range of new housing options across income. So in order to do that, it seems to me that the right course of action is for the city to do what it does well and the private sector to do what it does well. So the city is the lead on amending its own general plan, rezoning, and general plan amendment plus local coastal plan amendment. And the private sector is already working on how can they assemble the necessary capital to build those. Because this isn't going to be what you would call government housing. This is going to be general plan amendment, rezoning, local coastal plan amendment, so that the private sector can come in and invest and build those 4,000 units citywide, but specifically 1,800 of those housing units south of Laurel in the downtown area. In order to do that, I have found over the years that there are two things that the business community wants, whether it's when I was a county supervisor, county treasurer, state legislator, mayor. There's two things they're interested in: deductibility and predictability. Now, we don't have any deductibility issues, that's state legislative work. But what we can do is the predictability issue. And I think that between what the state is requiring, what we can do here south of Laurel, together with potentially a new privately funded Warriors Arena, multi-use facility, we can have sometime in the next 4 or 5 years compliance with the state law, a very energetic, lively downtown from which everyone benefits, from the top of Pacific Avenue all the way down to Beach Hill, that we will have a new, expanded, vital, exciting downtown, which will then provide both property tax revenue, sales tax revenue, transient occupancy tax revenue, which will then benefit the entire city in terms of our parks, our open space, our public safety issues. All of those can be helped by that development. Now, in order for that development to be one which affords opportunities for people of all income levels to live in that environment, to work in that environment, to thrive in that environment, I believe the necessary piece of that for the city to engage in addition to the planning activities, is to have an affordable housing bond, as we've talked about earlier. On one side of that bond would be the brick and mortar side of homelessness, such as shelter, navigation center, permanent supportive housing. The other side of that would be to close the gap on very low and low income housing development. Because nonprofit housing developers will say that after they've done everything they can do, they're still $100,000 to $250,000 per unit out from being able to make the project work. That would be where a bond would be able to provide funding that closes that gap, so that we really can have 20% of everything that is built south of Laurel have it be affordable housing in the very low and low income categories. If we don't do it that way, what's likely to happen on the natural is that something between 12, 13, 14% would end up being affordable housing. So we have to act affirmatively to increase that very low and low income housing stock, so that we've got a downtown that does in fact provide opportunities for people to live and work in the same community, within perhaps blocks of their job, not miles of their job. And that helps us on our greenhouse gas reductions, on our climate change issues. We're not going to save the world by ourselves as the city of Santa Cruz in terms of climate change, but we should do what we can do on that issue. Reducing vehicle miles traveled between home and work. Having a community, a neighborhood, set of activities in our downtown that also work in terms of greenhouse gas reductions and climate change. So I see the development downtown as serving to solve, at least in part, an awful lot of issues, and making a leap the magnitude of which we haven't seen in Santa Cruz before. And I think will be quite helpful in addressing a wide range of issues, whether it's the state's goal on housing, our own desire to see housing at various levels, and to see the degree to which all of that can be helpful in our greenhouse gas reduction efforts. Frankly, the values of the community were environmental protection, and we were focused on that. And I think that was correct for us to focus on that. There was nothing more than a little head nod given to the idea of affordable housing, for example, in Measure J, the county's growth management ordinance, with regard to how many housing units were built and designated under Measure J as permanent affordable housing. The county and the city have not done good work, and I put myself in that category. I was a county supervisor between 1988 and the end of 1996. I had 8 years on the Board of Supervisors to do something about that in the 80s and 90s, and didn't do it because the value in the community at that time was something between slow growth and no growth to try to control our own destiny. So although we did a good job on that, the effect of that, among other things, was significant increases in price of housing. Now that I'm in office, where the values have changed and the political values, at least in the city of Santa Cruz, are no less about environmental protection. But the voters think we've done a pretty good job on that. What we haven't done a pretty good job on is the housing side. And so now, as mayor of Santa Cruz for the next 4 years, my priority is meeting the housing demand in as many ways as we can across an affordability spectrum. And I think the only place that level of density can occur to get the kind of mix that will allow very low, low, moderate, and above moderate income housing is to concentrate most of it in our downtown. Having the lightest footprint possible, then do what other cities have done for decades, and that is you increase your density in your current most dense area, which for us is our downtown. It's basically Pacific Avenue, Front Street, River Street, from basically the top of Pacific Avenue down to Beach Hill. That area is where most cities, you will see this in other cities throughout California. Some have adopted this earlier than others, some later, some are just getting around to doing it now like we are. But look at downtown in many jurisdictions, and you'll see that what they have done is increase their density in their downtowns, revitalize their downtowns. We know after the Second World War that single-family home ownership in subdivision tracts throughout the country, but certainly in California, that was a high value was placed on doing that. What we also saw in concert with that was downtowns dying economically. We saw some cities come back from that by reinvesting in their downtown on the public sector side, and then the private sector would come in and avail themselves of that through redevelopment or a number of other strategies that have been used for decades in California. In Santa Cruz, we really do have one and one only option, as I see it politically, to hit our number on housing of all kinds, but especially very low and low. And that is to concentrate 45% of it in our downtown. And I think that's the only politically viable way to do it, and the only way that we're likely to comply with state law. Well, I think there will be an awful lot of public policies as the city updates its general plan and the housing element of its general plan, there will be lots of one-sentence policies that will be incorporated in that are designed to encourage the development of housing. That's in order to get the state to certify the housing element of the city's general plan, which is going to be under intense scrutiny by the Department of Housing and Housing and Community Development. They are looking at every submittal from every city and county, no matter how large or how small. And they are sending those back to cities and counties if they don't have the most robust pro-development, pro-housing policies possible. For us, as we go through that process, the challenge will be to comply with state law while preserving neighborhood integrity and character. Again, that takes me directly back to the lighter the touch on neighborhoods in terms of additional development and housing, the degree to which neighborhoods are going to accept that is going to be directly related to how much housing is built south of Laurel. The more that is accomplished in the new neighborhood south of Laurel, the less political pushback there will be to council members in their council district, in their neighborhoods. We've got a new council member, Scott Newsom, who represents Lower Ocean, Beach Flats, much of downtown, then going up into other neighborhoods. And he is 100% supportive of taking 45% of that growth in his council district. The other council members should be sending him Christmas presents to thank him for that, because that means in their area they will be asked to take much less, which will then cause much less political pushback. And we take ourselves back in time when talking about this, because this is 150 years of the state-local government relationship being upended in 3 years. The state has largely left cities and counties alone to be self-determinant in terms of their land use policies. The state has done a complete 180-degree turn on that. There's a certain irony in that, because most state legislators have been either city council members or mayors or members of boards of supervisors, so it proves my theory of where you stand depends on where you sit. When they were city council members, mayors, and supervisors, they thought they should be in control of their own destiny. When they got to Sacramento, they're pretty sure the state should be in control of local government. So I never fail to point out where you stand depends on where you sit. So having done it in the reverse order, where I was a state legislator, now I'm a mayor, I see things through that lens now. And I understand that the state isn't going to retreat on this issue. They're probably only going to get stronger on this issue of housing development. Now, I wish that what they would do with that is that they would match up the level of aggression they want us to take in terms of new development with funding for very low and low income housing. I will get very specific about that. Last fiscal year, the state had an almost $100 billion surplus. I asked them and the governor to take $40 billion of that $100 billion, still leaving them $60 billion over and above every funding need they had. Take $40 billion of that, put it in a fund for cities and counties to help them meet their very low and low-income housing numbers. They didn't do it. I said, in the event you don't do that, then on the November 22 ballot, please put a $40 billion general obligation bond issue on the ballot, which does not raise taxes in California because it has first claim on the general fund for the same purpose, setting that bond money aside for very low and low-income housing to help cities and counties meet their regional housing needs allocation number. Crickets from Sacramento on that. What did they do with them? What's the single biggest thing they did with that money? They sent everybody a refund check for the price of gasoline. To me, that is one of the more, shall we say, non-meritorious spending of billions and billions of dollars. When every person who ran for election to the state legislature, including the governor, ran for re-election, said their highest priority was housing. And they were glad to pass bills which make local governments do it. They don't seem nearly as interested in providing us with a funding source. So absent a funding source, we'll do it ourselves. And that's why I think we have to go to a bond issue in 2024. It would be nice if the state would have used some of its surplus when it had surpluses year after year after year. Went from 30 billion to 60 billion to $100 billion in surplus. Now they're forecasting a deficit this year. So our opportunity is gone. So we have to do it ourselves. I'm not complaining about that. I'm simply setting context in which we have to do it ourselves. And I think the voters in Santa Cruz are supportive if they can see real results over on the homeless side and over on the affordable housing side. They'll support that. They will support it. I'm sure they, like us, wish that the state had done something different. But it doesn't make any sense to spend time cursing darkness on this. We have to light a candle and move forward. And what I see that being is an affordable housing and homeless bond on the 2024 ballot. Whether that's March or November, what the details of it are, all are issues which will come together over the next few months. But I don't think we have a choice on whether or not to ask the voters to do that.